Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Sustaining Culture When Everyone's Remote. I'm Paul Michelman, Editor-in-Chief of MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's program is sponsored by Skillsoft. This event will be recorded, and the recording and slides will be available to all attendees approximately 3 to 4 business days after the end of the live event, and via the handouts module in the GoToWebinar control panel. We welcome your questions. To submit questions, please enter them anytime in the questions module on the control panel. We'll answer as many questions as we possibly can. If you encounter audio or other difficulties during today's program, please follow the instructions in the questions module. Our speaker today is Jennifer Howard-Grenville. Jennifer is the Diageo Professor in Organizational Studies at the Cambridge Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge. Jennifer, over to you.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. When I wrote this article at first, working remotely seemed like a temporary necessity. And increasingly, we're looking at it as part of our new reality. It's almost daily that we read about a new organization that has declared that their white-collar workers, at least, can stay remote from the office until 2021, or maybe forever. Increasingly, we're seeing organizations, banks, tech companies talking about a new way of working in a hybrid fashion so that people will be in the office for a portion of their time and the office will be used for certain types of activities, and home working or remote working will remain a significant portion of the work week for many employees. So we're really moving into a very different phase, even from when we were a few months ago, thinking about the role of remote work and how it influences a company's culture and how a culture can be sustained and perhaps has to adapt when everyone is working remotely. So I'd first like to just hear from everybody with our first polling question about how would you characterize how your culture has been shifted as a result of remote working. So do we have the poll available? The questions are essentially, what influence has your company moving to remote work had on the culture? And you see the choices there, mostly positive, putting strains on our culture, it's a mix, or there's been no influence. So take a moment and fill in your responses. Thanks. Hopefully this won't take too much thinking. And there's a choice for, I think, every possibility. So we'll wait to see what comes up. Okay, it's been mostly positive, about a quarter of you, putting strains, mix of the above. So mix of the above is the dominant one, about 59, 60%. And there's been no influence. Okay, so thank you. The researcher in me is happy in the sense that actually something is going on. And I think that, again, we would anticipate that there are both positive and negative aspects to culture. So this move to having sustained periods of remote working or hybrid models recognizes that there are some positive aspects that have come about as a result of remote working, some of which influence the culture, such as the opportunity in some cases for work-life balance, spending less time on commuting, finding ways to portion one's work throughout the workday to enable productivity in the best way possible. But also the negative effects on the culture are also very clear, and we'll talk much more in detail about that. So thanks for your participation. No matter where we fell on that question, though, there's one thing that is really obvious for all of us in terms of remote working, and that is that none of us are physically together. Now, companies obviously are starting to move back into office spaces, but again, in a very different way. And there would be a lot more plexiglass if we were back in the spaces as depicted on the slide. So culture is often thought of, at least at a surface level, of having a lot to do with the physical environment, the physical space that we share when we're working. And, we think about a certain type of culture being associated, for example, with an open plan office, with a very modern look as opposed to a more traditional look, for example. We think of the quality of the food provision as being an aspect that conveys and captures a culture and drives a culture even. And we think of the good old foosball table, as I call it, where the Silicon Valley startup brought us the idea that you could have a fun, collaborative, creative, innovative culture by having games at the office. Now, these aspects, though, are really only the surface manifestations. They're what Ed Schein, professor at MIT in organization studies, would call artifacts of culture. So they're the things that can signify what a culture might be, but they don't fully capture it. They are not the essence of culture. They're simply a manifestation. What really does matter, though, about our shared physical space is the opportunity we have to interact. So culture really lives through people's interaction. And I'll get into that in a moment. But obviously, the physical space and the nature of the interaction influence each other in a profound way. But we need to remember that it was never really about the quality of the food or the foosball table. It was about the quality of human experience and connection that was fostered by those. So when I think about organizational culture, I very quickly move away from what many people default to as culture, which is the notion of values. Values are important. These are the sort of simple and high-level ways that most organizations convey what matters to them and what they want their culture to be, but they're often aspirational and frankly quite generic. And so I tend to think of culture, having been trained in this way, much like an anthropologist would. And as a sort of business anthropologist, we would go into an organization and we would watch for an extended period of time, and we would live with and live like the members of the organization. Because what we would be watching for in this sense is not what people value or what's stated on the company website about the values, but really what I call practices, or how people do things day to day. How do things get done? And then again, through deep immersion and being there much like an anthropologist would for an extended period of time, we try to understand how are those practices connected to certain meanings, to certain sets of beliefs that these members of the organization seem to hold and perpetuate. And these things explain why they're doing the things that they're doing. Now, there's a very strong connection, or at least there should be, between the practices, what we see people doing, and the beliefs about them. But we, again, just like we can't be fooled by physical space, we can't be fooled just by practices. Let me give you an example. So imagine you go into an organization and you're privy to a meeting and you see people having a very vigorous, robust discussion and disagreement. That's a practice. And you observe it time and time again, and you think, yes, this is truly how they do this in this organization. You go to different departments and you see it being done in all sorts of different functions, roles, and groups. You go to different geographies and you see it being done there too, and you say, wow, this must really be a practice that is part of this organization's culture. But in order to discern what it means, you need to know a little bit more about what that organization is trying to do with that practice. So on the one hand, I could watch this robust discussion and disagreement and conclude that all of these people don't trust each other, they disregard others' ideas and proposals, and they discount others' expertise. Or the same discussion, the same robust discussion practice could mean that they believe strongly in the power of debate and diversity of experience to arrive at superior solutions. So those are two different beliefs associated with what might manifest as actually the same practice, the same thing that you might observe them doing. And so by being there for a long period of time, both members of an organization and those who observe organizations and research culture can start to put these things together and to start to uncover what seem to be the core beliefs that are manifest in this organization that are associated with those practices. And again, they could be quite different. Now, the other really important thing is that these beliefs aren't just stated. So they need to be practiced in order to be sustained. And people need to see a certain amount of this in practice to actually believe that these things mean what they mean. So if I tell somebody we're having a robust discussion because we really respect each other and think this is the best way to arrive at a solution, and I experience that differently, the whole thing breaks down. Okay, so culture we can think of as this sort of tight coupling between what we do, how we do things, and what this means to us. And again, thinking like an anthropologist, all groups and organizations grow a culture. It just emerges, often, yes, seeded by the founder and what the founder wants to do and how they want to do things and how they believe things should be brought forward, and indeed their values and aspirations for the organization. But they also grow up through the group actually just working together. And so much like a tribe that an anthropologist might study, these are things that have worked for that organization, for that group, as they encounter challenges in their external environments, and as they work out how that they can best work together with their unique set of skills and capabilities as human beings. So that's how I think about culture. And I think it's a useful way to move away from simply statements of values. We'll get into that a little bit later, but so what does this all mean when we get to remote work? Well, if we're all sitting either at our kitchen table, our sofa, or in my case, I have a home office in a garden shed, which is very British, and we're interacting largely over online communication means, we don't observe practice in the same way. We don't have ways of conveying to each other the richness of our communication. How many of you have had a truly vigorous debate over Zoom? People tend to maybe not engage in quite the same way for a variety of reasons. And so that puts a strain on the this sort of natural sort of reinforcing nature of culture as practiced and as driving and therefore fulfilling these beliefs. So there are a lot of things that can change as we move into an online setting, and I don't think we know all of them yet. However, I would like to introduce the second question for you to engage with, and we can think about culture manifesting multiple different levels of the organization. So at what level for your organization has the influence of remote working become most apparent? So first of all, for individuals and their sense of belonging to the organization, for teams and their ability to perform together, for the whole organization, or for none of the above. And I'm now wishing I put all of the above in there, but we'll see how you do. At what level is the influence most apparent? Okay, so it looks like, well, it's apparent. That's one thing for sure. So 96% of you said it's apparent somewhere, or at one of these levels. And it's almost evenly split, although interestingly, for individuals and teams, it's showing up more profoundly now than for the whole organization. Super helpful. Let me go through quite quickly how culture, I think culture is influenced when we're in a remote work environment at all of these different levels. And as you clearly are seeing, I'm sure, and grasping yourself, individuals derive from culture a sense of belonging. And also there's a need to be socialized to a culture and to understand the nuances of actually how we do things in this culture. And those, I think, call me old-fashioned, I think are mostly done through face-to-face interaction and people being in the physical space and surrounded by their peers over a period of time. And I think it's really challenging for us to think about how we replicate that in an online environment. I had the opportunity to speak to somebody at the University of Cambridge yesterday about culture, and his question also was, how do we think as an 800-year-old institution about sustaining our culture as a university and as a set of 31 colleges within that university when our new students arrive in the fall? And those of you who've seen Harry Potter know that the college experience is much like Harry Potter. But you can't just have that remotely, and you can't just have that in theory because you watched Harry Potter. There is a real sense of being in the places and engaging in, for example, the formal dinners and moving through these spaces and seeing how other people act or interact within them that I think is really critical for helping people to actually feel the sense of belonging. And so I don't have the answers. I think it's a really important question, and I see companies doing all sorts of creative things to onboard new employees, for example. But I think that will continue to be a real challenge, not just for new employees, but also for existing employees to continue to be tied to something that they're not experiencing in the same way. Secondly, of course, groups benefit from having a certain type of organizational culture, because the right kind of culture at least can foster the sense of trust, the sense of psychological safety, the sense of cohesion that enables team performance. And the notion that we might have hybrid work and we might create new ways of teams and groups working together. We might create what researchers call in-groups and out-groups, which are both important, but mean that people treat each other differently. That is a real concern. So when one portion of the team is on site and another is not on site, one is going to have to think very, very carefully about how you create inclusion and cohesion within that setting. And finally, I think it was indicated in the poll that you're seeing it less right now, but my prediction is in the long run, organizations as a whole will feel the influence of remote working on culture very profoundly, in the sense that, yes, we read productivity levels are up, but I think that can be attributed to a number of things. First is anxiety, and second is, people perhaps gaining more time due to lack of commuting and working out new ways of working. But the long-term effect in terms of how does an organization enact creativity or innovation when people aren't able to sort of bump into each other? How do you reproduce the effects of serendipity online? I think that will start to show up, because again, research shows that these kinds of things, serendipitous encounters, people being able to bump into their colleagues, share concerns, brainstorm things, things that are very difficult to create online, do have a huge long-term impact on how that organization is able to function and come up with novel solutions. Okay, and finally, as I mentioned earlier, when the work itself is shifting, how we do things has to shift, and that can sort of break down this reinforcing cycle that I was talking about earlier. So as I mentioned, if everyone is on an online platform and it becomes more difficult for some reason for them to engage in a robust debate, then what does that really produce in terms of our ability to reinforce the idea that we come to better solutions through robust debate? Will that fall away? Will that no longer have meaning for us? Will that no longer be a part of our culture? So again, I think these are long-term things that organizations as a whole have to pay attention to. So what I wanted to mention next is that, again, very consistent with this cycle that I've been showing you between practices and values, recent work in sociology has sort of crept into organizational studies, and we're increasingly talking about culture, again, not as a set of values, but as a toolkit of habits and practices. So the emphasis is on what people do. It's on skills, it's on habits, it's on how we do things. Yes, they have certain meaning to us, but the toolkit metaphor tells us that we have a lot of tools at our disposal. A recent work by Donald Sull that is published in the Sloan Management Review looks at companies' value statements, and not surprisingly notices that a lot of companies have very similar articulated values, and they have relatively few of them. So I think the number is sort of average of 5-ish, plus or minus. When we think of a toolkit, we observe that actually there are many, many ways of doing things in organizations, some of which are really common and shared, some of which you will find no matter if you walk into the accounting department or the R&D department, others of which are not so commonly shared because they're more specific. So you don't necessarily want your accounting department to be taking risks on a daily basis, for example. But that might be something that happens in a certain sector of the organization. So Toolkit reminds us that we have flexibility in how we use the tools at our disposal, and it reminds us also that we actually have these are tools. So we put them to work. And it's only when we put them to work that we produce the values or beliefs or aspirations that we intend to. It also says that we can use them somewhat flexibly. So just like you might use a hammer to prop open a door if you needed to, people in organizations can take their cultural tools and retool them in a way that wasn't envisioned. And this means that that cycle that I showed you can sort of shift and evolve over time, which is both good and bad. So I want you to try this idea. Many people find it a little challenging at first, but the next polling question is asking you to think about if you had to articulate your company's toolkit in terms of what are the bits of culture, what are the habits and skills and practices available to the organization as a whole, how does it look in terms of how varied and expensive these tools are in your toolkit? So I've given you the options of, we have a pretty small and tightly constrained toolkit. That's the first option. You know, the way if you were to go to different geographies, different departments, you'd see people doing things more or less in the same way. The second option says, you know, we have some core ways of doing things, but actually in other pockets, they vary a lot. And the final choice says, we've got a toolkit that is so big and so cluttered. We've got a whole bunch of things at our disposal and we use them quite differently. So have a go with that question, and we'll see where we get on that. Okay, so good. Okay, so half of you have said we share some core practices, others vary a lot. Yes, and we can talk about the notion of subcultures. We can talk about core versus periphery. And this is actually really important because a lot of, there's been research that shows that when organizations know what aspects of their culture are the most core and most central, those are the parts that A, you want to retain, and B, you can use to actually adapt and shift to new circumstances. Pretty uniform might just be signaling what kind of organization it is. So again, some organizations are more uniform in terms of the work they do and the people that they employ, so we might expect that. Another way of thinking, and this work, the toolkit notion comes from a sociologist called Anne Swidler, and she later wrote about the same thing and called it a repertoire, which I also wanted to mention because a toolkit seems very static and a little jumbled at times. A repertoire reminds us that actually people are very skillful in using culture. So we might have a lot of tools at our disposal, but when we are well socialized in and well practiced in the culture, we actually know how and when and where to use and not use certain cultural tools. It's like we have certain pieces of music or pieces of dance in our repertoire, and we know how to put them together and we know how to adapt them to the particular circumstances. So it brings this notion of skill in. I'm going to go a little quickly because I realize how I'm doing on time. And I've written elsewhere about this, but three myths about culture are quickly overturned when we move from thinking about culture, sort of values, aspirations, and beliefs at its core to thinking about it as practices that are in a toolkit. And the three myths are at the top here: that leadership would exclusively define and control culture, that organizational insiders control culture, and that culture operates primarily through consensus. And I think it's clear from your responses so far that you would not, you know, ascribe to those myths. When we see culture as more of a toolkit of practice, we see, yes, leadership does have an influence strongly over defining culture, maintaining it, helping articulate what it is, but also culture must be practiced and guided by the employees as well. So you can't make a declaration that you're going to perform a certain performance from the repertoire if your employees are not skilled and practiced in actually being able to do that and actually do that. And the second myth gets overturned by when we see that actually when we think about culture as part of a toolkit or a repertoire, we realize that people are skilled and practiced in lots of things. And those things come from both their experience in the organization and their experience outside the organization. So we've increasingly started to talk about organizational cultures as what we call open systems. And you can see that very evidently in all organizations now being called on to respond to new demands from society for inclusivity, for diversity, for responsibility or sustainability, for example. So we know that cultures actually bring in and take up from their members themselves and from other demands in society, other aspects. So it's never just about insiders defining a culture. And finally, this notion of consensus, as you've observed, there's some degree of consensus. There needs to be, or else it wouldn't really be a culture, which is a thing we do together. But it need not make sense all the time. We can see contradictory elements of our culture coming forward, depending on the situation that we're facing. We can see portions of the organization that address things in very different manners, depending on the role that they're performing or the nature of the work. And so we should think more of culture operating through a sense of coherence. It makes sense to us, which means that it's not uniform, but we can accommodate and manage the tensions within it. And that's actually a really important component. So now, when work is remote, what do we need to do to make sure this culture as practice, as a toolkit, is sustained? Now, it's funny that the first thing I would tell you is make sure you tell people about it, when I've just been trying to reinforce how important it is that culture is a skill and habits and practices that people do day to day. But I think this is one of the key challenges when we don't have the ability to communicate as richly as we do in person and face to face, to bump into each other, to have our culture reinforced through other aspects of, again, the nature of the space that we're working in, the displays that we see on the wall, the artifacts, the prototypes, the things that we encounter when we're moving through a physical space. We need to be much more explicit and mindful as managers and leaders about reminding people what we are doing. What are these valued practices and habits when we're seeing them in action? So when people are having that robust discussion, remind them, hey, guys, this is the way we do it. This is how we get to those good solutions. This is who we are, because they're not going to have the additional cues that might reinforce that. Similarly, we need to call out when culture isn't happening, isn't being practiced. So if everyone's sitting on their hands on Zoom and you suspect that they might be actually on Twitter on the side on their phones, that needs to be made explicit, and we need to remind people that we work well together through a certain set of practices and habits, and that even though we're going to have to accommodate those and adapt them in a remote working environment, we can't let things slip too far, especially when it, as you've observed, it is a core aspect of the culture. The second piece I would say is, inevitably as work shifts, and as I've mentioned, this notion of hybrid work, this notion of sustained periods of remote working is going to be a very interesting and challenging time. There will be modifications to how people do things, to what day-to-day practices they bring into their work. There just have to be, because we're all working through new modes. I was lucky enough to have finished my teaching for the academic year. I did actually one day of teaching remotely. It was a full day program right at the beginning of this lockdown that we had in the UK. And I'm now tooling up and reading and researching and learning how to do the kinds of things that I would do in the classroom, but do them over a remote platform. And so inevitably we are all going to be, already have, and will be making adjustments and finding new practices. But again, the point is to take the new practices that might support and reinforce the existing beliefs that we have, the existing aspirations that we have as a culture, and inculcate those and recognize that these are new ways of doing what we were trying to do all along, and support those kinds of adaptations, but being explicit about it, being mindful of how this fits into this cycle of what we believe is important to us, what it means to us, and how we practice it, and make sure that those are mindful and intentional inclusions rather than random inclusions that either break that cycle or disrupt it and send it off in a different direction. And I think the final piece is, this incredibly profound moment of disruption, and it's not a moment, it's a prolonged period. And we need to, as organizations, pay attention to what this cultural core is, and ideally where it came from. And so this is where cultures do overlap very profoundly with other aspects of an organization's identity, of its leadership, and perhaps of its founding leadership, and sharing stories of where the organization has come from, and how these cultural strengths or aspects of culture arose, and how they're manifest today and can be used as strengths for navigating the future is really important. As I was writing this article, because I'm an alumni of MIT, I did my PhD there, I still get updates from President Raphael Reif, and it was interesting to me. I had never known that MIT really moved from being a technical college to being a world-class research institution during World War II, under the pressing need to develop radar. And he referred to this and talked about how the strengths of sort of radical interdisciplinary collaboration and a commitment to science and innovation arose at that time, and that and reminded the community that these would be characteristics that the organization could carry forward as it moved into the future. So that's just one example of how organizations can again be explicit about who we are, what we value, what we believe in, and how that has become a core part of our toolkit and needs to be a set of tools that we continue and practices that we continue to draw on as we move forward. I think in the interest of time, I would love to end there and move to discussion and questions. I have one more piece on thinking about how culture might be a tool for change, but I think it's time to move on to the discussion.
Jennifer, thank you very much. I'm going to pull up my webcam and I invite you to do the same.
Yeah.
Great presentation, great grounding in an issue that's so hard to solve. And a reminder to our audience, thank you for your questions so far. There are already quite a few, and please feel free to add more as we go along. But Jennifer, I want to start off in talking about what I see as a really interesting and not easy tension to solve. One of the things that managers have come to appreciate over the past several months is that the pandemic is not so much a shared experience as it is millions and millions of concurrent experiences, right? That we are all having based on the same phenomenon, but based on our personal circumstances, right? Our age, where we live, our responsibility as caregivers, our health. And so to that end, we've been encouraged, even admonished, to recognize the very individual nature of the pandemic experience and to make sure that we're attending to and respecting each person's individual circumstances. But corporate culture requires a collective mindset, doesn't it? So how does a team leader emphasize the collective ways we do things, the way we do things around here, while respecting the individual and what they're dealing with in this extraordinary time?
It's a great question, Paul. Absolutely, culture is the way we do things around here, and there's a we to it. And as I mentioned earlier, this notion that you cannot have a culture as an individual. It is a group phenomenon. It is something that a group develops or an organization develops as they articulate what their goal is collectively, and as they learn how to work towards that goal. Now that said, I think the question of what is the role of the individual within it, like many things that have been brought forward in the pandemic, this is not a new question, it's just newly urgent. And so absolutely, I am on board with everything you've said. We are having multiple different individual experiences. Some people have found it freeing and they're more productive. Other people have found it stifling and they're barely hanging on, and everything in between. And I think I really feel for managers who are managing individuals through all of those individual circumstances. However, I don't think it's an either or, I think it's a both and. I think it's an opportunity to think about, has our culture actually served the individual ever as an individual? And how has it served the individual as an individual? Because one of the things that I also like to emphasize about culture is, it isn't just something that stands apart from everything else, like strategy and marketing plan and innovation plan and people management and recruiting. It should complement all of those. So the culture should be one that is designed, might be too strong a word, but that is oriented to bringing out the best in people, and that people come in and connect with the culture because it fits with with what their skills and strengths are. This doesn't mean people are uniform, but it does mean that there's always a piece of the culture that needs to be mindful of who we have within the culture. And also, I think we need to keep in mind this point about, culture is bottom up as well as top down. So what we do as individuals might become more varied. Our toolkit of practices might have to expand to accommodate multiple different individual circumstances. But that's the beauty of culture, is actually we make it. And we make it in line with who we are and what we're trying to do as an organization. So we can remake it mindfully and intentionally, just like any other aspect of organizing.
Thank you. So I'm going to move from a philosophical question to kind of a practical question. Is technology the only solution for compensating for the lack of visibility of remote work? I mean, can culture really survive over Zoom?
That's a challenging question. And I, as a researcher, I would say we'll have to wait and see. We'll have to wait for the evidence. As someone who has been thinking about culture and studying culture for, more than 20 years now, and as someone who has sort of been trained in the way of thinking about it anthropologically, we are really challenged in terms of thinking about how do groups create, generate, and sustain these ways of working together when and if they were entirely online. Now, colleagues of mine who study, who do what's called netnography, which is ethnography over the net, sort of looking anthropologically again at online communities, would say, absolutely, you can have a community that is entirely online. The open source community would probably define itself as having a certain type of culture. And we as outsiders would recognize that. So I'm not saying it's impossible to have an entirely, to generate a culture in an entirely technologically mediated way, but I think the traditional ways that we think of as organizational cultures and the ways they serve, as I mentioned, individuals, groups, and the organization as a whole in terms of socialization, belonging, cohesion, performance, underpinning innovation and change, the traditional ways that we think about those are, I personally cannot see substitutes entirely technologically mediated, but I will be watching.
So I called that a pragmatic question. It actually wasn't at all pragmatic. It was also philosophical. So thank you for bearing with me. Here is a somewhat more practical question. What are some ways that companies can take the temperature of how the culture is performing during this time? I mean, I think it's hard to capture with data, isn't it?
Yeah, I like to share a story. When I did my dissertation research ages ago, I spent 9 months full time at what was then the world's largest semiconductor manufacturer. And one day in a town hall meeting, a senior manager stood up and said, right, over the next few weeks, you'll see rolled out the culture survey, and everybody has to attend the culture survey meeting for your group. We need minimum 90% attendance at those meetings. Minimum 90% completion of the culture survey, and we want a minimum score of, whatever it was, 80% on the culture survey. And I sat there as a very junior person at that point and as a new researcher, and I thought, that statement has just told me more about the culture here than any survey could ever tell me. So we love to try to measure culture and take the pulse. I'm not against culture surveys. They serve a purpose. They mostly, in my mind, capture how people's sentiment about how they're supported in the organization, about their management, about the climate in the organization. And I think that's hugely important. But to me, culture is really about these beliefs and these practices. So in that example, the practice was, we measure something and therefore it matters. And this was a company that is, was at the time and still is world beating in terms of its technology. And so it was data driven. It was filled with engineers who were going to set performance targets and meet them. And so culture was no different, or, the enactment of the culture survey was no different. So I think the bottom line is we know culture through stories. We know culture through what people do. We know culture through, I like to tell people, ask yourself, what would a newcomer need to know to actually operate in this organization? And right now, if the answer is different, or if the answer is, well, a newcomer would have needed to know, but now everything's chaos, you know that you've got a shift going on in terms of the culture. So survey if you want to, but a qualitative sense of feedback from employees, I think, is far more important.
So crises, as we know, can bring out the best in organizations, but they can also serve as an excuse to act differently, right? To not worry about things like culture, because we got to get this work done.
Yeah.
So if you're in an organization and you're not in top leadership and you're witnessing kind of more senior people behaving in ways that seem to go against the company's stated values, how do you deal with that?
Wow. Yeah, that's a tough one. Do you call it out? How do you call it out? I was talking last week with an individual who we were having a conversation because she is engaged in working on, the company's adaptation to their new way of hybrid working. And, they have the whole list of, which offices are going to shift in terms of maybe some would close and some would do this and some would do that. And there were training plans and there were all sorts of plans. And she said, and I'm in charge of culture, but, I feel like the whole thing is moving so fast and I'm sort of, but wait, we need to get the culture right. So I think, for better or for worse, culture, because it seems so self-perpetuating, a little bit mysterious and sort of holistic, it's really hard to pin down and survey and quantify. It does get this sort of, well, we can't manage it. We've got all these other things to manage. And I would say you cannot not manage it. You cannot actually let things run out of line with the culture for too long, because as you know, people see the seams, they see the gaps, and they start to become very cynical. Leadership walking the talk is important, and leadership recognizing that culture matters and that they actually, while they don't define it, they set the tone, really matters. So I don't know about your individual circumstance, but in that circumstance, I would speak up. And I would potentially speak up in a way that is questioning. And actually, I have seen this in, I'm part of an organization. I think we have a sense of what our culture is, but we're afraid to sort of, really ask about it because we don't quite know about it. And I have raised that with our senior leadership. And I have said, I'm seeing some things happening here that actually are in line with our culture. And I think we need to remind people who we are. And they've done that. Now, that was less of a challenge and more an opportunity. But I think, like you said, people are very attuned in a crisis to what could go wrong. And culture feels like it's a long-term thing. But if you don't pay attention to it and tend it, it's going to come out of alignment. So be bold.
Thank you. Are there any kind of particular cultural traits? I know you wouldn't have had the chance to research this, so I'm going to ask you to speculate a little bit, but certain types of cultures that have likely kind of fared better or fostered kind of a better situation in remote work, say companies that stress psychological safety. Are there certain cultural attributes that are particularly important right now?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this isn't research-based, but I think these are questions that many companies are asking. We went through sort of a period of, in the 1980s, when the world discovered, or at least the Western world discovered organizational culture. There was this sense of, you had to have a strong culture and you had to have a certain type of culture. And there was a huge amount of effort poured into creating a certain kind of culture. Now, obviously, depending on the industry you're in, the people you're in, the strategy you're executing, the culture must fit those aspects. So it's not like you can look over the fence and say, they have a great culture, I'm going to get myself one of those, because if it doesn't fit, it's not going to work. On the other hand, the aspects that make a strong culture are one that is actually consistent and authentic. I think authenticity is a word that doesn't really get sort of used and queried enough. And authenticity to me means that it meets people where they are, it meets the skills and capabilities and expertise of the employees, and it meets what the company is trying to do, and it works. Now, underpinning that means some degree of honesty in who we are and how we do things. So we're not throwing you things saying this is our culture, this is what it ought to be, that you can't do or that make no sense or that are sort of flavor of the month. So an authentic culture where people actually have comfort in who we are, I think no matter whether it's strong or innovative or risk-taking or whatever labels you want to give it. I think an authentic culture is one that is going to stay together more. But I absolutely agree, Paul. There are certain aspects of can people feel themselves at work? Is it an open and inclusive environment? Do people feel trusted? Is there psychological safety in the sense that people can speak up when things aren't going right and where they're not afraid to fail? Those are some of the attributes that makes for better relations between people and therefore better culture.
So thank you. Let's talk for a moment about companies that may have had cultures under stress or underperforming cultures prior to the pandemic, or maybe organizations that have yet to articulate a culture. Perhaps they're a younger organization still growing. Presumably, there's a challenge that those companies face in this environment, but perhaps we can talk glass full for a moment. Is there an opportunity to either establish or reestablish a better culture during this environment?
Yeah, there's always an opportunity. I think with culture, people in large organizations, established organizations that have had a certain type of culture and see the need to change it, like to undertake these huge organizational culture change programs. I would not advise doing that right now. And I frankly, personally would never advise trying to change an entire culture. If we go back to this sense that culture is how we as a group have grown up to make sense of what we're doing together and to do it effectively, we all have a culture. Even if you're a relatively young organization, you have a culture. It might not be as developed. It might not be as articulated. It might be more inconsistency. It might never have encountered situations that it has to adapt to. So, but you have ways of working together. So I always argue, the best way to think about change in culture is to think about what aspects of our culture are valued, are core, and are really working for us. And then think about, so it's like opening up your toolkit and taking an inventory. What do we have in there, and which bits are actually our go-to bits that are working for us? And why do they work for us? Oh, because it enables us to make better decisions, which enables us to win more customers, which enables us to be, whatever, right? So connect it to what the organization is about. And articulate what the cultural strengths are. Even if you're a new organization or an organization that you feel, oh my goodness, we don't have trust, we don't have psychological safety, you have something, right? You are a culture. And so look at the strengths and try to work out, well, if one of our strengths is we're really, really, really detail oriented, and yes, that might be holding us back in certain ways, but we have a bunch of people who are really, really, really skilled in the tool called detail oriented, go with it, right? Build from the strengths, especially at a time like now when people need to feel supported and need to feel comfortable and need to feel like they're being asked to do something they can do, and say, how does being detail oriented help us adapt in this new environment that is massively uncertain, right? So how can we actually build from that orientation to detail to, perhaps move in a slightly different direction or in a complementary direction. And I think those are key to understanding not only where your culture is at now, but how you might evolve it. Yeah.
So on that note, who owns the culture? And particularly as we're thinking about kind of steering our ships forward in these very uncertain waters, what's your view on creating a head of culture role in an organization? Is that useful, necessary, or should this be more of a collective accountability?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, many organizations have a head of culture. Many organizations, we think of HR having a special role in this, and/or leadership, ideally both. But to basically say we've got one of those and let's let them manage it, completely misses the point about culture, which is it is collective, it is experience, and it is practice. Now, just having said that, that doesn't mean that we all need to attend to it, because we have other, tasks and abilities and expertise. So I think, again, it's sort of a both and thing. It can be very useful to task somebody with this idea of taking inventory of who we are, what we've got, what we like, what we need to amplify, what we might need to redirect, what we might need to suppress. So that can be someone's job, or ideally several people's jobs, to pay attention to that. It's like anything else, right? You wouldn't say, oh, strategy is always emergent, innovation is always emergent, everyone owns it, and therefore we don't have a head of strategy or a head of innovation. You would both and. You would encourage your people to do innovation, but you would also guide that innovation. And I think culture we can think of in much the same way. It shouldn't be mandated, but it should be articulated and it should be mindfully tended to. And I think the other role that we can keep in mind is it's not just either everybody or somebody, it's actually there are cultural champions throughout the organization. I've studied some cultural change agents who I found super inspiring with colleagues a few years ago, and the thing that blew us away, they were working on really interesting issues within their organizations, introducing issues around sustainability or different models of sort of being an organization. And what really struck us was, these people had been there for ages and they didn't start in the roles that they were championing. They didn't start working on those issues. They've been in IT for 15 years or, marketing for 10 years. But what they did was they really knew how that organization worked. They knew how its culture worked and how to get things done. So there are champions at all levels who really understand a culture deeply, and they should be part of this journey as well in terms of thinking about how do we sustain, adapt, and maintain our culture.
So how do we differentiate between kind of those sacred practices that are meant to stand up to any disruption and those that need to be tuned with the circumstances?
Yeah. Again, I would take the guidance from the organization's history and what's worked for it time and time again. So in one of the organizations I've studied and written about, also in the Stanford Social Innovation Review article that I've mentioned in the slides earlier, they really saw themselves from day one, from their founding, as an organization that was about innovation. And when it came to introducing, again, the notion of sustainability, they did that through the channel of innovation, because everybody got how to innovate. And actually, it wasn't necessarily everybody got how to innovate, right? Like, again, you don't want your accounting department to be innovating daily necessarily. But the key people that needed to drive this change and needed to own this change and needed to demonstrate that they bought into sustainability were the product developers in that case, and they were kings and queens of innovation. And so using that aspect of the cultural practice of we are innovators, we believe that how we get ahead in the market and how we have, and that we have grown up literally as a company defined by that by our founders, and we demonstrate it time and time again. That was a very, very good cultural practice to latch the concept of sustainability on, but it had to be done through people who were respected for what that core aspect of the culture was, which was innovation. And it was a multi-year, multi-pronged practice. It did not, come about as sketched out and planned explicitly. It was quite opportunistic in many ways. But I think going to, where did we come from, what has served us, and what is continuing to serve us in terms of our cultural practice, those are the bits that are ideally worth holding on to. If they're not, you've moved into a radically different situation, and that might be a situation where you question, is this even the culture that we are? But yeah, and I think, again, ask people, right? And it's not necessarily a survey, but if I were to be a newcomer in this department or in that geography or in this aspect of the business, what would I need to know to get my work done? And the answer might, there'll be some similarities, that's your core, and there'll be some differences. There's a nice piece of work that actually a colleague of mine has done on 3M, and they talk about, in this very long-lived organization, they talk about the same thing, which is that the aspects of the cultural toolkit that are regarded as core are the aspects that are tied to its founding identity and its history.
Jen, as we kind of turn towards the top of the hour, would you take a few minutes and talk about culture as a tool for change?
Sure. Do you want me to go back to the slides, or I don't need...
We can just do it.
No, I'm just going to do it. I'm not going to go back to the slides, but I might need to put my glasses on so I can read my notes. Even though I have spoken through several aspects of this. But yeah, just to reiterate that that I personally see this notion of changing the culture as sort of a big and somewhat scary endeavor. Companies attempt it all the time, but through massive programs, and I think they find it very difficult. So the first point is simply the point of departure, which is saying, which is asking a different question. How can we change an aspect of our culture, or what we as a culture are pursuing or doing, what we as an organization are pursuing or doing through using our culture? And so, the first step of that is literally, as I've said, take the inventory of your cultural toolkit. So look inside, ask people, think hard about, what are the day-to-day realities? Who gets ahead in this organization? How do they do things? That's not going to show up necessarily in the value statement. Hopefully it's aligned somewhat, but really understanding what are the practices that get done, how widely shared are they, how important are they, how integral to the founding stories of this organization are they. That will give you a sense of what's core and what's more peripheral. Go to the core and figure out, how do I use that core to be a different way? How do I take that core of who we are? So for example, we might be a company that was founded many years ago, that was committed to the idea of taking care of our community and our families, and that we have that type of orientation. Now, our community, both the community that we operate in and our community as employees, might have changed radically over that time in terms of their backgrounds, in terms of their experience. And so how do we continue to enact that sense of who we are and how we treat each other as community and as family in a way that is being called to open up, to be more inclusive, to engage more diversity, for example. So the cultural practice and the belief that this matters to us, and this is why we're doing it, and we feel embedded in this community, and it helps us as an organization in some way, that aspect of the culture isn't changing, but it's adapting and tying into what it looks like in the contemporary environment. And so that's a sort of what I call a grafting process of saying we have this aspect of our cultural core. We now know what it is. We know how we practice it. What do we need to bring into that to be a legitimate way of still practicing it to meet the needs of the environment that we're in? The good news is some of that is happening for you, right? Because culture is an open system. So your community has changed. So let that change have a voice, and notice it. So it is, again, this sort of, what's our aspiration? Where are we being guided towards? And what aspects of our existing culture are we using to guide? But also let's listen to who we are and how we're enacting that. And let's learn and bring forward some of those ways. And it really is about attaching those and saying, hey, we're about this, we're doing this, those things are together. So a lot of what I see as managers and organizations doing, especially around culture, is making sense for others. So making the sense that we sort of know is there, but in our busy minds and all of the tasks that we're doing, we haven't put together. And that's the way that it, again, authenticity can be perpetuated in culture as it sort of moves forward into meeting new demands. And finally, I think, we would be remiss to not deal with the fact that some aspects of culture are not going to suit. Some aspects of culture are no longer okay. And so, it's really important, and a colleague of mine has written on this, Herminia Ibarra, also in the Sloan Management Review, on those rituals, those things that the company might have been doing forever that were really important to performance management, for example. If you're trying to move in a new direction and those things are visibly opposite to it, you've got to get rid of them. So it's not just about grafting and happily bringing everything forward. It's also about being honest about which bits of our practices are undermining the change that we're trying to make.
Should our cultures aspire to influence people outside of our organization? Because some of what you say there kind of suggests that there's certainly the potential, right, to take a much more expansive view of the role of culture, especially in this kind of ecosystem world that we live in, where what used to be contained within a single organization now actually requires cooperation between many.
Absolutely. I think both influence and be influenced by. I really think, you know, we all think that we have a sense of what an organization's culture is. Also, you know, organizations want to create a distinctive and unique type of culture, again, depending on the type of organization they are and how they're facing consumers and others. And we don't want to be fake in that, but I do think there's a huge opportunity around enabling our culture to influence other entities, other organizations. And I think in this connected world, you know, supply chains and everything else, the reach of the organization is so huge. The traditional organization where all of the tasks are contained within a single organization, everything's shifted. So we need to think of culture much more in this open system fashion.
Great, thank you. Those are perfect final words. Jen, thank you so much. Folks, that's all the time we have for today's session. Thank you for all the great questions. And as always, I'm sorry that we only got to a small portion of them. Over the next few days, please look out for a survey via email. We would really appreciate your feedback. That concludes our program. Thank you for attending. Thank you, Jennifer Howard-Grenville, and thank you to our sponsor, Skillsoft. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.